Hello, I'm Daniel, the man to come. Today is going to be a shorter video, more of a philosophical monologue, like the one I did on the previous Sunday. And it's going to be about the existential dread that we face as young men aspiring to be great. And such, without any further ado, I'll start about the myth of Sisyphus. This is a story from the ancient Greek mythology, and it's quite an interesting one. So who was Sisyphus? He was the king of Corinth back in the day, and he was quite a cunning man. He always did things for his own benefit and tried to trick everyone around him to ensure that he is living a good life. And he did a lot of these strange things. For example, in ancient Greece, there was this idea of the gods' pantheon, such as Zeus. And Zeus would enforce a rule of hosts and guests. That hosts had to make sure that they were always respectable towards their guests, regardless of the situation. Sisyphus wouldn't follow through with this kind of moral agreement. So whenever he would have guests over from a different kingdom, if they did something disrespectful or something he didn't like, he would simply torture or get rid or kill them and take their belongings. This was unacceptable by the gods, but he acted this way, and it allowed him to have basically a full iron fist control over his city, which of course made him happy, but it wasn't exactly the appropriate way of doing things back in the day. Another really cunning and kind of bad thing he did was he had a big quarrel with his brother, and he didn't like his brother. And so what he ended up doing was he seduced his brother's daughter, so his niece, who bore him children, and then he wanted to use those children to get rid of his brother. Basically, also very tricky kind of person, not nice, not exactly a noble man. And then eventually he finds out about this nymph, or I think it might potentially be a daughter of a water god, this daughter was taken by Zeus and being flown away back to wherever he lives. And so as the water god followed through to save his nymph or daughter, not exactly sure the details, he saw him flying through and knew where Zeus was headed. So when the god of water came to Sisyphus, he told him, okay, I'll tell you the location if you give my city a natural spring water, like an access to spring water from the city, from the middle of the city. Which of course the water god did, and he gave out the location of Zeus, which Zeus, the king of gods, didn't like. And in this way, he really angered and pissed off repeatedly many gods. At some point, not exactly sure whether he dies, because it's different depending on the different historians you read, but whether he exactly died straight away, or if he was dragged into the underworld, either way is possible. Regardless, Thanatos, the god of, not the god of death, but the embodiments of death, so it's like the Grim Reaper, the equivalent of the Grim Reaper, dragged him into the underworld, and Zeus set a punishment for him. So Thanatos was supposed to enchain him with these magical chains that would lock him in the underworld so he wouldn't be able to free himself and would be suffering there for the rest of eternity. When he was in front of these chains, he started talking to Thanatos, and he says, hey, how do these magical chains work? Can you tell me a little bit about them? And he starts to bring up this conversation. As Thanatos starts to explain how this whole thing works, Sisyphus grabs the chains and ties Thanatos. So in this image over here, this is actually, the painting is actually Hercules fighting Thanatos, fighting the death, the embodiment of death. But let's imagine this is Sisyphus, right? And he ties him up and locks him in the underworld. Sisyphus then heads up back into the world of the living. But since the embodiment of death is locked in the underworld, people stop dying. And that's a terrible thing, meaning you get poisoned but you don't die. People have, in a war, a soldier gets hit with a sword or something, he doesn't die. People of old age suffering who need to die can't die. And basically death stops in the living world. And out of everyone, the one who gets annoyed by this the most is the god of war, Ares, who he enjoys watching wars, and suddenly all his soldiers aren't dying anymore, which makes the whole thing boring. And he basically decides to take care of this issue and goes down into the underworld, finds the chained up Thanatos, and frees him. And you'd assume that Thanatos would go after Sisyphus to kind of punish him and take him back into the underworld where he belongs, but instead, he's actually kind of worried and scared. I mean, if Sisyphus managed to lock up the Grim Reaper once, what stops him from doing it again? And he doesn't pursue him, meaning that Sisyphus gets to live up until his death. And on his deathbed, he's lying there and he calls his wife and asks her, "Once I die, could you please throw my body out into the middle of the city onto the streets?" Obviously, that's not a normal thing to ask. Usually they would bury the body, or there would be some kind of ritual that's related to the tradition of the ancient Greek religion. But in this case, this was an unusual request which she followed. So when Sisyphus dies, he goes to the underworld and he meets the queen of the underworld, Hades' wife, Persephone. And Persephone, she's a very nice goddess in a way. And so he starts to convince her, telling her, "Look, my wife made a mistake. My body's not supposed to be lying out in the streets. It's supposed to be buried. Please send me back up there. Let me find her. I will punish my wife and teach her exactly how things are supposed to be done. We will bury the body and I will come back." And Persephone, touched by his emotional spiel, allows him to leave the underworld again. So this time, he's tricked death twice. He goes out into the living world, but instead of actually going to the body and burying it, he just leaves out and starts living his life anew. And at this point, obviously, Zeus realizes what's happening, that there's this man who's basically cheating death and tricking gods, and he decides to punish him. And he asks Hermes, the god messenger, to go and drag him back into the underworld. And now Sisyphus is in front of Zeus, and Zeus sets him up this punishment. The punishment that he sets up, it's a very famous one. It's a boulder. Basically, he gives this opportunity. You either go into the underworld as usual, or you have this task. The task is simple. There's a big cliff/mountain, and we have a boulder that is very heavy. Your goal is to take this boulder and push it, shove it, pull it in any way you can, all the way to the peak. If you reach the peak, you're free to go. But if you don't, well, you got to keep doing the task. Sisyphus accepts this task, not knowing that Zeus enchanted the stone, the boulder. The higher the boulder gets, the more it wants to roll back down. The more it starts to slip out of his hands, the more it starts to push on and become heavier, which makes this task impossible. And so Sisyphus, and this is called a Sisyphean task, is a task that is meaningless, meaning that he pushes the boulder higher and higher up onto that mountain, and when he reaches the highest areas and where the incline becomes too steep, suddenly the rock starts to slip out of his hands and it falls and rolls all the way back down, and he has to run back and push the boulder once more. And this kind of torture, this kind of challenge, it's really strong in this allegorical, metaphorical kind of sense for humans, where we live our lives and we're constantly repeating the same tasks, some of which are meaningless. Some jobs, mailing out maybe paper ads that many people maybe don't read and throw them into the recycling bins, and then that goes over again, turns into new papers, and you recreate these ads and you send them out again. You're doing a meaningless task. You're getting paid for it, but it doesn't have real meaning. It doesn't give you reason for life. And we have this philosopher, Albert Camus, who basically wrote an essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, and other essays, where he discusses this existential issue, the issue of the absurd. He claims that man and the world are two entities that we know exist, and they are connected. And they're connected by only one simple concept: absurdity. That the absurd is what gives us both meaning and suffering in life. And this is the sense of absurdity, like when a man with a sword runs against an army of people with machine guns. You know that's absurd because it's impossible, it doesn't make any sense, it's beyond our understanding. And he says that that absurdity that everyone encounters in their lives stems from this idea that man has certain desires and ambitions, And then the world is cold to those ambitions. The world doesn't provide everything you need. In fact, the world only worsens it. If you know what the concept of entropy is that every system, if you want it to become more orderly, requires a force from the outside, meaning that everything always becomes less organized, less orderly, falls apart, like your phone. It starts to crack and starts to break apart over time. And then you can buy a new one, but you have to build it, you have to recreate it. Your walls, they get dirty, they fall apart, and you have to repaint them. You have to constantly exert more and more effort to somewhat meaningless tasks so that your life can achieve whatever desires and goals you have. And so, what Camus says is that this idea of the myth of Sisyphus is crucial to our own reasoning for life. That the only time a man actually finds true reason is when he accepts the absurdity and starts to work with it, for it, into it, and through it. When absurdity becomes a kind of reason for your existence, when your goal to overcome the absurd, to take that leap of faith, to jump a distance that you've never jumped before, to climb a height you've never climbed before, to repeat a menial task that has no meaning, but you do it better than everyone else. It's at these moments when life starts to actually be meaningful, where it is better to live than to die, or tasks that are worth dying for, not just dying simply. And it all has to do with this big sense of absurdity that you have to embody and accept. And us as men, we have to learn to do this. We have to look at the tasks before us and be like, I'm wasting my life working at this McDonald's or something. That's okay. Take it and become best at it. Start with this, and then you'll be able to take that ability of doing something really well and apply it to something else in your life. Facing the absurdity is the skill you want here. Looking down into the void as the void looks back at you. And I'm going to read what Camus said on this. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. And I think you can. You're pushing that rock up, and after about 20, 30, 100 tries, you know exactly at which corner you must put your legs so that you can finally cross that next barrier. You know at which side of the rock you should roll it when you're at a specific point on the mountain. You know when you should take a rest and when you should give it a harder push. And after years and years, you know that you are literally the best person at pushing this stupid boulder up this mountain. You know that there is no one out there who can do this perfectly. And in about 5 minutes, you're going to do this again, and you're going to do it better. And then when Zeus looks down upon you, and you look back upon Zeus, you smile. That is what we should aim for. Aim for that in your own life, and you too will be, as Sisyphus, happy. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was a good little episode, and if you liked, do subscribe, and you can always donate in the links below. I'll see you next time. And the following Sunday there won't be an episode, but maybe we'll do one next Wednesday. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.